Paul Reubens knew he was running out of time. Across 40 hours of interviews, he finally revealed what he had hidden for decades, that he was gay, the man he had loved, and what the arrests had done to his life. Yet he kept the cancer shortening his time from filmmaker Matt Wolfe, and pulled back when Wolfe reached one name. Phil Hartman had helped build Pee-wee, then publicly exposed their estrangement after years of silence. By then, Phil was dead, leaving Paul alone with everything they had never repaired or explained. They once used index cards to guarantee Pee-wee's stolen bicycle would return. So why, after revealing almost everything, could Paul still not finish the story of the man who helped him write it? Before the gray suit became a refuge, Paul had already learned to divide desire from survival. Born Paul Rubenfeld in 1952, he grew up largely in Sarasota, Florida, where the Ringling Circus made eccentric adulthood look possible. Local theater led him to Cal Arts, but a stop in Los Angeles changed his direction. There he fell in love with a young painter named Guy, and moved with him into an Echo Park apartment. Guy's habit of calling food chocolatey or buttery later slipped into Pee-wee's voice. When the relationship ended, Paul stopped living openly, avoided another consuming romance, and poured himself into a career he believed he could control. The public man would soon behave with complete freedom, while private Paul disappeared. Phil Hartman met him just before that division hardened. He carried exactly the skills Paul's unruly invention needed. Born in Brantford, Ontario in 1948, Phil studied graphic arts, designed album covers, and entered comedy because drawing alone had become isolating. During a Groundlings performance in 1975, he volunteered from the audience with such force that co-founder Tracy Newman compared his arrival to a hurricane, and the troupe invited him to train. By the time Paul joined, Phil was one of its dependable stars, capable of finding a voice, sharpening a line, or holding a scene steady while another performer overturned it. Paul later remembered that the two performers became friends almost immediately. Pee-wee belonged to him, but Phil helped give the character company, structure, and resistance as Captain Carl, the gravel-voiced sailor whose dignity survived talking furniture, Miss Yvonne's attention, and Pee-wee's jealous interruptions. One man made disorder irresistible because the other never stopped treating it seriously. Their partnership became necessary after Paul lost an audition for Saturday Night Live and answered rejection by borrowing money for a show of his own. The Pee-wee Herman show moved from a Groundlings midnight slot to 5 sold-out months at the Roxy in 1981, dressing adult nightclub mischief in the cheerful grammar of children's television. Phil's Captain Carl supplied weight, while Paul protected the illusion by giving interviews as Pee-wee and asking journalists to treat the character as real. From the seats, the laugh and red bow tie looked invulnerable. Across the street from the Roxy marquee, Paul saw Pee-wee's name and suffered an anxiety attack. Phil noticed another danger and teased him for abandoning his other characters, arguing that he was squandering his range. Paul heard the warning, then chose greater immersion, refining the walk, voice, suit, and rules until Pee-wee could carry an entire career. The character who never apologized for being peculiar was becoming the safest place his creator could stand. A red 1947 Schwinn near Paul's Warner Brothers bungalow redirected that career again. He abandoned another movie idea for a quest built around the bicycle, then hired Phil and brought in Michael Varhol because none of them had written a feature screenplay. Paul bought Sid Field's manual, and the three men followed it almost mischievously, covering a bulletin board with 3-by-5-inch cards and placing every turn where the book instructed. The bicycle disappeared around page 30 and returned around page 60. Varhall later recognized Phil's hand in the sharp action descriptions and part of Pee-wee's declaration that he was a loner and a rebel, while the finished film credited all three writers. Tim Burton directed without sanding away their handmade strangeness, and Pee-wee's Big Adventure became the kind of movie whose bicycle, basement, dance, and roadside ghost survived after individual scenes blurred. On paper, The Lost Object came home precisely on schedule. Success would make the people around that board much harder to recover. Paul opened the next door for Phil himself when Pee-wee hosted Saturday Night Live in November 1985. Paul and his manager persuaded Lorne Michaels to let Hartman and John Paragon come to New York as outside writers because Pee-wee's voice was difficult for strangers to imitate. Contracts completed afterward paid Phil and Paragon $1,750 each, but the room offered something the fee could not measure. Michaels watched Phil contribute in meetings, found him funny and easy to work with, and soon saw what Paul's Groundlings circle already knew. The following season, Hartman joined SNL as writer and performer, becoming the man who could impersonate a president, rescue an unstable sketch, or make another comedian funnier without fighting for its center. The gift moved in both directions. Phil had helped make Pee-wee large enough for a movie, and Paul had carried Phil into the institution that would transform his career. Accepting that opportunity also took him out of the world where their loyalty had formed. For one season, the two futures still met on Saturday. CBS launched Pee-wee's Playhouse in 1986, and Phil reprised Captain Carl while beginning his SNL life 3,000 miles away. In the Playhouse restaurant, Carl requested lobster. Pee-wee advised against it because there was none, then proceeded as if the exchange were perfectly sensible. Phil held the sailor's authority just long enough for Paul's logic to win. Around them, a chair spoke, flowers watched, a genie lived in a jeweled box, and the secret word could make an entire room erupt. Yet Carl never behaved as though any of it required correction. Maintaining both productions was impractical, and he disappeared after the first season when SNL claimed his schedule. The departure removed more than a character, because Phil could now become presidents, attorneys, announcers, and strangers, while Paul remained inside the one identity they had helped make famous. Distance explained why Captain Carl left, but recognition and control would determine why the two men stopped finding their way back. Those subjects had already become unusually painful for Paul by then. Although Pee-wee's Big Adventure carried his character, script, and visual judgment, he watched Burton receive much of the public recognition and later admitted that the imbalance made him jealous. He responded by protecting creative authority more fiercely, a perfectionism that made extraordinary work possible and collaborations difficult. Phil had carried Captain Carl from the stage into television, co-written the feature, and believed some of that labor had not been properly rewarded. Their competing claims cannot be reduced to one dishonest friend. Paul's authorship was real, Phil's contribution was real, and success made the border between them more expensive. Then, in July 1991, Paul was arrested for indecent exposure at an adult movie theater. Reruns vanished. jokes multiplied, and the first uncostumed image many Americans learned was a mugshot. During those opening months, Paul called Phil for the first time in years, reaching toward someone who had known him before Pee-wee became both shelter and evidence against him. The line reopened, but the partnership did not follow it back. Phil later described that contact on Howard Stern's show and said they had been estranged since he joined SNL. When Stern suggested that unpaid work and insufficient credit were behind the break, Hartman agreed they were part of it and said he could have pursued a lawsuit but chose not to. He also spoke harshly about the conduct behind Paul's arrest, placing an old professional wound inside his former friend's most humiliating public chapter. Yet the interview preserved its own contradiction. Phil called the falling out unfortunate and still described Paul as an extraordinary talent. Paul never gave an equivalent public account, and decades later, Matt Wolf said he believed the broadcast had betrayed Paul, while acknowledging that Paul had never confirmed that interpretation. Wolf found limits whenever the documentary reached Phil, because Paul was sensitive about criticizing a man who could no longer answer. Respect remained without trust. Hurt remained without a final accusation, and neither side supplied the clean verdict that television wanted. Their separate careers kept displaying what each had first recognized in the other. At Phil's 1994 SNL farewell, castmates presented him with a bronzed stick of glue, turning his gift for holding a scene together into a literal object. News Radio and The Simpsons then carried that calm precision into new rooms. Paul moved almost in reverse, allowing Pee-wee to recede while accepting smaller roles under his own name. His recurring performance on Murphy Brown earned an Emmy nomination, and later characters revealed the range Phil had once warned him not to bury. Recognition now worked backward, as the stern sailor from an old Playhouse episode became SNL's master impressionist, or a voice from Springfield, while adults who had known only the red bow tie discovered Paul inside an entirely different face. The work invited viewers to reconsider both men, but it could not reunite them. Every new Hartman character proved he had needed a larger world. Every convincing Reubens role proved Phil's early warning had been right. There was still time for a private conversation until May 28, 1998, when Phil, 49, was fatally shot while sleeping by his wife Bryn, who later died by suicide. The violence was especially difficult to reconcile with the colleague remembered as steady at the center of other people's chaos, and it changed every unfinished disagreement from temporary distance into permanent record. No reliable account establishes a final meeting apology or repaired friendship with Paul, and Paul never invented one afterward. What remained was untidier: Captain Carl on film, 3 names on a screenplay, Phil's grievance, Paul's telephone call, and admiration that neither man had converted back into trust. Death did not determine who had been right about money ownership or recognition. It removed the only other person capable of answering Paul's memory. The old bulletin board cards had promised that a lost bicycle would be waiting when the story reached page 60. After Phil's death, there was no longer anyone waiting there. Paul spent the next years discovering that withdrawal could not restore control. A second legal case tied to his vintage art collection returned him to headlines. The more serious charge was dropped, and in 2004, he pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor obscenity offense. He guarded costumes, photographs, props, recordings, and correspondence with archaeological care. The archive preserved Phil, as well as Pee-wee Captain Carl's uniform, the screenplay credit, and the paper trail behind the bicycle adventure. Paul could decide what survived and when Pee-wee returned, but he could not fill the absence among those objects. Preservation became his answer to a culture that could reduce a complicated life to one damaging image. In 2010, Paul rebuilt the Pee-wee Herman show in Los Angeles and on Broadway, then returned again for Netflix's Pee-wee's Big Holiday in 2016. The adults filling those seats no longer needed the playhouse explained to them. Its colors, rhythms, and unembarrassed silliness had survived the years when its creator was treated as though one headline contained his whole meaning. The revival also made the missing original company easier to see. Captain Carl could remain young on old footage, but could not walk into the new production, and Paul could now tell the history without being interrupted or corrected by Phil. While promoting the film, he instead described Hartman's contribution with unusual precision, their immediate friendship, Phil's warning about wasted range, the screenwriting manual and index cards, and the SNL invitation that placed him before Lorne Michaels. Paul did not erase the fracture to restore the credit. He let both remain. Then he remembered the small coffee group of Groundlings friends who once imagined they would go out and rule entertainment together. Nearly 2 decades after Phil's death, Paul considered where that plan had ended and said, "That didn't work out very good. I think about Phil all the time." He supplied no reconciliation scene, no defense against Phil's grievance, and no explanation for every silent year. The sentence carried unusual weight because Paul chose to leave it unpolished. He could name the opportunity he had given Phil, return the craft Phil had given Pee-wee, and admit that distance had never made the man irrelevant. Paul did not use Phil's absence to settle the old argument in his own favor. He restored the friendship, the warning, and the opportunity beside the grievance, allowing their worst exchange to remain true without becoming the whole relationship. Paul's final interviews placed that restraint beside disclosures he had guarded even more fiercely. He spoke about loving Guy returning to the closet and believing an openly gay man would not have been allowed to build a mainstream career entertaining children. He described a life split between Paul and Pee-wee, while withholding from Wolf that he had lived with cancer for 6 years. Paul died on July 30, 2023, at 71 weeks before another scheduled interview, leaving more than 1,000 pages of transcript and no chance for the filmmaker to press the question still open. Guy belonged to Paul's romantic life and helped shape Pee-wee's private vocabulary. Phil belonged to the creative brotherhood that gave Pee-wee an adult counterweight, a screenplay, an opportunity, and a history of conflict. The documentary could place those relationships beside each other without pretending they were the same. But Paul's death meant other hands would decide the final arrangement. What Paul left about Phil was not a last-minute confession of romance or a tidy story of forgiveness. It was the truth of a friendship that had carried both men to fame and left gratitude and injury tangled together. Phil helped turn Pee-wee into a world others could enter. Paul opened the SNL door that changed Phil's future. Success turned shared work into contested ownership, and hurt never erased the friend Paul still carried. By refusing to reduce Phil to the stern interview, Paul gave him the fairness the public had rarely given Paul himself. What remained was unfinished gratitude, grievance, shared authorship, and absence because death took away their chance to choose a cleaner ending. Their screenplay could schedule a recovery. Their friendship could leave only evidence. Pee-wee as himself premiered in 2025 because Wolf completed the arrangement Paul could not. He placed Paul's recollections beside archival evidence of Phil's grievance, allowing affection and injury to occupy the same history instead of manufacturing a forgiving goodbye. The film also restored a fuller scale to Paul's public record. Pee-wee's rooms had welcomed sailors, cowboys, artists, loud children, shy children, and objects too alive to behave normally, while the man who created them spent years concealing what he believed America would punish, and then watched a few images eclipse the joy. In an audio message recorded the day before his death, Paul asked to be understood beyond the labels attached to him, and said his work had been rooted in love and the wish to bring people delight. The documentary later won the Emmy for Outstanding Documentary or Non-Fiction Special, recognizing Paul posthumously as an executive producer. Nothing difficult was erased. It was finally returned to proportion. Look again at the bulletin board Paul, Phil, and Michael Varhol arranging little cards while a red bicycle waits to be lost and recovered. The children who entered that story never needed to see the board. They only knew that Captain Carl could keep a straight face while Pee-wee made ordinary rules collapse, and that neither man asked the room to become less strange. Their friendship never reached the return scheduled in their screenplay, yet Paul's late words brought Phil back with credit, injury, affection, and no invented farewell. When you see Captain Carl now, do you remember the laughter or the friendship that never found its way home? Share that memory. Then subscribe for more carefully researched stories about the relationships hidden inside familiar careers.